Hello, second grade. Today we are going to start to make this yarn weaving on a cardboard loom. We're going to use a simple cardboard loom that I've already set up and set up for you, and we're going to do some plain weave over one, under one, over one, under one, alternating rows. And when we're finished, it'll look something like this. So the way that we start is you start with your very own cardboard loom that I've set up for you. I've already got it strung. On one side there are two pieces of masking tape. The side with the masking tape is the back side. So the way that you start is you get a piece of your own masking tape off a roll, lay it down on your table, and use your pencil to write your name on the masking tape and the day you have art. Day A, day B, day C. You're going to pull that masking tape up and you're going to tape it to the back of your loom. The same side with the masking tape, the two ends of masking tape. Then you're going to flip it over, and this is the front side, the side without any masking tape. That's the front. You'll go over to my yarn box and you'll choose a small amount of yarn out of the box. And I'll talk more about that to each class on how much yarn you should take and how you should cut it and pull it out of the yarn box. And you're going to start weaving this yarn over one, under one, over one, under one. So remember the two parts to a weaving. There is the warp, which is the base of the weaving, the loom of our weaving. So this is the cardboard loom. The warp are these strings, which are going to be the base of the weaving. And then the weft, which is the yarn that we're going to weave into the base, the warp. So if you look at our finished one, these white strings are our warp, and then the colored yarn is our weft. So you're going to start on one side. I'm right-handed, so I start on the right. And when you start your very first one, you can start over one, under one, or you can start under the first one and over the second one. I always like to bend the end of my yarn a little bit. If I use the end of it like this, it starts to fray and come to pieces. So if I bend the front of my yarn just a little bit with the loop, I'm going to go over my first black, under my second, over my third, under my fourth, over one, under one, and see how I pick each one up. Then you're going to pull your yarn all the way until you have a little bit of a tail hanging out. Now I'm going to come back the direction I came. So I came from right to left, and now I'm going to go left to right. So I'm going to find the end of my yarn, make another bend in the yarn, and I have to do the opposite of what I did the first time. So the first time, if I look right here at the end, I ended over the warp string. It's over, the pink is over. So I go under the warp string. So I go under the first one, under, over, over. And this time when I pull the yarn through, I'm going to pull and pull until this touches the black warp. So now I'm done. I don't want to keep pulling to where this black warp bends. I want to keep the warp nice and straight. Alright, so now I'm going to go back to the beginning of the yarn, and I'm going to come back this direction. So if we look at this last piece, this last part of the yarn, am I over the first warp string? Is the pink over the first warp string, or is it under the first warp string? It's under. So I'm going to go over the first one, under the second one, over, under, and pull. Not too tight to where this bends, but pull, and then notice how I keep pushing these up because I want these close together. I'm going to zoom in a little bit closer just so we can pay closer attention to our over-under. So now, the pink, is it over the first warp or is it under this first warp? It's over the first warp. So I'm going to go under. Since this is over, I start under. Under one, over one, under one, over one, under one, over one. And I'm going to pull and pull this yarn until it touches the black, the warp string, and then I push this up, pack it up against the last string that I wove. Now I'm going to keep my loop, my bend, the end of this yarn, and is this last part of the pink, is it under the warp or over the warp? It's under the warp. The pink is under the warp, so I start over the warp. Under, over, under, over. And you're going to keep doing this back and forth until you get to the end of this yarn. Now you know you're doing it incorrectly. You know you're alternating incorrectly if you go across. And when you pull the yarn through, look what happens. It comes undone, doesn't it? So that last time I went across, I just wasted that work because I alternated incorrectly. So if you alternate correctly, over one, under one, over one, under one, and then you come back under one, over one, under one, over one, then it'll always stay in the loom, and you won't pull it out when you pull this across. So I'm going to keep going across, back and forth, until I get to the end of this pink. So I'm going to try and just keep going pretty quickly so you don't have to wait on me, because I want to show you what you do when you get to the end of the color that you're working on. So you can pull a longer piece of the color that you want, or you can pull a shorter piece and cut a shorter piece out of the yarn box. It's really up to you. And I'm just going to keep going back and forth, pushing this close together, alternating each row different. The simple plain weaving is our objective, this plain over under weaving. And this can go across one more time probably, so I'm going to go across one more time. And then I'm ready for a new string. So since I'm ready for a new string, I'll go to the yarn box, I'll pick a new color, I'll cut off what I want, and then you're going to tie the end of these two strings together. So you're going to loop and swoop, and tie it one more time, loop and swoop, tie a knot, tie them end to end, and pull that knot, make sure it's tight and it's not going to come undone. If you struggle tying the strings together, I would be happy to tie them for you. All you need to do is bring me your loom with your string on it and then your new string, and I will tie them together for you. And then you go to the end of the new string, make a loop, alternate under one, over one, under one, over one, the opposite of what you did last time, and you just pull through and you pull the knot through. And you'll just keep weaving back and forth as if that knot's not even there. So now the knot is kind of in the middle of my weaving, and that's okay, because at the end, when we're finished, I will show you how to tuck that knot in. And then I'll go under one, over one, under one, over one. And I just keep going back and forth and doing a plain, simple weave. So second grade, here is another tip that I want to give you when you're doing your loom weaving. If you keep weaving back and forth and your hands and fingers start to get tired because you keep lifting each string up that you need to, every other string that you pull up, and your hands or fingers are getting a little tired, one thing that you could try to do is just take a regular pencil out of the bucket and slide that pencil underneath all the warp strings. Slide it down a little bit and leave yourself a little area to work. And then that lifts those warp strings up for you so that you can kind of get the yarn under the warp a little bit easier, and it's less tiring on your fingers and your hands. So if you're struggling to pull the warp strings up so that you can get your weft string or your colored yarn underneath, then slide a pencil under all of the warp strings, all of them. You don't have to worry about the over under with the pencil, just slide the pencil under all of them. And it gives just a little bit of space to kind of tuck this weft string, this colored yarn, underneath your warp strings. Now second grade, I know that I told you that I would show you at the end how to tuck these knots in, but on second thought, if you just leave all these knots and make sure both tails are sticking up on this side of your weaving, when we finish your weaving off, this will be the back side, and we'll flip it over and you'll have a front side to your weaving. So as you knot and go along, I want you to make sure the tails, the double tails for each knot, is sticking up on this side. Don't have it tucked in or get woven into your weaving by accident as you weave. So keep all the knots on this side poking up with all the tails. Okay, so second grade, now that you've reached the bottom of your loom, it starts to get pretty tight, and I want you to make sure that whatever yarn you cut, you weave. So if you cut a big long piece here at the end, you're really going to have to weave all of it. So don't cut too long a piece once you start getting closer to the bottom of your loom. because once you get down here, it really gets tight and hard to weave because it's just all real tight. So as you work, push your yarn up close together, pack it in. You shouldn't be able to see these warp strings when you're weaving because you're packing or pushing the weft up close together. And then I have all my knots, all my loose ends sticking up towards me, all the knots and all the tails. And then this is the end of my last weft that I've woven. So now I'm ready to take it off the loom. So I'm going to flip it over. I'm going to zoom out a little bit. And I'm going to pull off all of this masking tape. I'm going to save the piece that has my name on it, set that on the table, and then I'm going to pull off the rest of this masking tape, and this can get thrown away. These two pieces here. Alright, so then I want you to take your warp strings and you're going to cut them down the middle. So, cut them all in half, and then you're going to pull these warps off of the loom. And the loom is pretty tight, so it holds those warps on there for you. So work with one end at a time. So this end, I'm going to pull these warp strings off. And then I'm going to carefully flip over my loom. And I'm going to tie these warp strings in knots. So I'm going to take these two warps. Now remember, I haven't taken the warps off this end yet. That's very important. I'm leaving those attached to the loom. So now I'm going to take these two strings next to each other, these two warp strings, and I'm going to tie a knot. Loop and swoop, pull and tie right up to the pink. I'm not going to yank it really tight. I'm going to kind of stop right when it touches the pink, and then I'm going to tie another knot. Loop and swoop and tie one more. Now I take the next two that are next to each other and I do that. So I'm going to loop, make a loop, swoop it through the loop, tie, make a loop, swoop it through the loop, and tie. My next two strings that are next to each other, loop and swoop, tie, loop and swoop, tie. And that leaves this one over by itself, single. So I take the end, one of the strings from the last knot that I tied, and I tie this together. This last piece that's by itself, I tie it to that last knot. So now all of these warp strings are knotted and tied, and they're going to hold the weft in place. And I can take my scissors and trim these a little bit. You don't want to trim them too short, and then this little bit will get thrown away. Now I'm going to go back to the other side of my loom. I'm going to pull these warp strings carefully through the teeth, and I'm going to tie the ends of these. So I'm going to take two of my warp strings. I'm going to make sure this pink here stays between the two so that when I knot it, it's going to hold it in place. Loop and swoop once, loop and swoop twice. Now I take the next two next to each other, do the same thing, tie a knot. Now these steps are very important that you do them slowly and you follow the directions that I gave, because right now my weaving could start falling apart because it's not completely tied up. It's close, but once you take it off the loom, it's really could fall completely apart. All your hard work could be lost if you don't do it step by step the way I show you. You don't want to take the whole weaving off your loom and then start tying knots and then it gets all lost and starts falling apart. You want to do one end at a time. Now here's my warp strings on this side. I'm going to trim them a little bit. And this is the front side of my weaving. This was the side that was down on the cardboard that I couldn't see, and this was the side I could see. This is the back, this is the front. But look at all these little tails that are sticking out. I'm going to flip my weaving back over to the back side, and I'm going to trim some of these tails, not too close to the knot, because I don't. If it comes untied, then it's I can't tie it back up. But I'm going to trim some of these, and I have to be careful that I don't accidentally trim the weft that I wove. And I'm just trimming the tails here so that they don't stick up out the sides of my weaving, and so that when I'm looking at the front I can see the tails. I want to trim those. So I'm going to trim those off. And now when I flip my weaving over to the front, those tails aren't sticking out and it looks pretty good. It's It's done nicely, and I've limited my color palette, so it looks like it's all tied together. And then the last step is to take that masking tape with your name on it that we saved when we took it off the cardboard loom and tape it to the back. And then this weaving will go into the turn-in box for me, so I can take a picture of it, put it on Artsonia, and give it back to you. So make sure your name is taped to the back. Good job, second grade. Way to go.